Thank you. It's a real honor to be with you all. Rarely am I with a group of people that I have to explain so little to. This is not true when I go to surgery conferences, I have to say. And rarely am I the most sober one in the room. But I was careful. And I was saying to Peter, I'm so glad I wore pants because there's a see-through podium, which I've never dealt with before. So it's all working out fine. I didn't drink, and I have pants on. I will admit, when Peter invited me, I had this momentary fantasy where I was going to wear a button-down shirt and take it off to start my talk. But it wasn't going to lead to what you might think. Underneath, I was going to wear a shirt I've designed but never actually printed that says, "This is your trigger warning." But I don't have that shirt, so if I took off my shirt, you really would need a trigger warning. I'm 51. Things don't work the way they used to. So what I'm going to do tonight is kind of break this talk into three parts. The first part will be the longest, and then we'll get to the other parts. But the first part will be a little bit about how I got into this. And I kind of have bridged into the scholarly side of the academic freedom problem. But as I'll tell you, I came to it because I was wounded on the academic freedom side. And my background is in history of medicine, and I actually do patient advocacy work. So a lot of the conferences I go to are actually support groups for people with particular conditions. And typically at those support groups, we have what we actually have here tonight. We have about half the people with the condition we're talking about, and then we have about half the doctors who are trying to figure out how to treat them. And so that's often what we have in this room, is people who have been wounded together with the people who know how to try to treat the problems. And to me, that's a very exciting kind of dialogue, so it's a real thrill to be here. So I'm going to talk in the first part about how I got into this stuff and how I got deeper and deeper into the academic freedom problem. I'm a feminist, leftist, progressive woman coming out of work done on behalf of sexual minorities, and yet I have found myself very much deeply in the problem of leftists trying to shut me down. And when I get to the middle of the talk, I'm going to talk about what I'm calling tonight the problem of stupid. And I'll explain what I mean by that, but I think the problem of stupid is actually the context in which we're dealing with the academic freedom problem. And much as I think it's important that we do what FIRE is doing so brilliantly, which is strategic strikes where there are problems, I think we need to think about the larger problem, which to my mind is the problem of stupid. And then the last bit of the talk is going to be about courage, which came up earlier in the day. And I'm going to talk about courage and kinship and where I think we need to go in terms of what courage looks like in these instances. People often call me brave. I don't feel brave. I often feel angry, but that's not the same as brave. And so I want to talk a little bit about having thought a lot about courage, because I'm sometimes asked to speak about moral courage, and I find that really weird because I feel like I have a moral viewpoint, and I have an interest in trying to pursue a more moral universe, but I don't feel courageous. So I want to talk with you tonight about what I think courageousness looks like, that I think is an implementable model for many of us, even when we don't feel brave. So the way I got into this work was after I dropped out of college and became a mortgage broker and then went back to school, I went to graduate school in history and philosophy of science at Indiana University. And I got my degree doing mostly history of science. And I was interested in gender and science because I had the feminist perspective that I still have today. And my dissertation director said to me, well, you should look at the history of hermaphroditism because nobody's done that. At the time, nobody had. So I thought I would look at the history of embryology and the history of Darwin's barnacles because they were hermaphroditic. And he said, no, look at medicine. And I thought, why would I do that? This doesn't happen in humans beyond the embryonic stage. But once I started to look at the medical literature, I realized there were, in fact, many cases of people who, into adulthood, had hermaphroditic conditions where their bodies were blends of male and female types. And to me, this was very interesting because I was 25 years old and sexually active and sexually aware, but I'd never heard of this. So I thought it was very interesting that it had been basically suppressed within our culture, made invisible. And this was in the 90s, so it was at the height of the post-AIDS bloom of gay and lesbian rights activism, which I very much supported and still support. So to my mind, this was a really interesting topic. So I began to do research into the 19th century to see what had happened to people who were at the time were labeled hermaphroditic. And people born with these conditions started to contact me. and they asked me to help with the modern day medical problem. And I didn't think there could be that much of a problem today. You know, I thought modern medicine is scientific. I was stupid. And what I soon found was that, in fact, the system of care for children born with these anomalies was very bad. It was based on lying to families, lying to children, trying to fix things early on so that nobody would know, and in the process of that, taking away often reproductive function, taking away sexual function, really troubling approaches that were really 1950s approaches that had persisted into the 1990s, not evidence-based. So I joined the intersex rights movement, and that was in the mid-90s, and I became one of the leaders of the intersex rights movement. And I did that for about 10 years as an academic. So I was running a patient rights movement nationally, along with doing history and philosophy of science as an academic. And as I was wrapping up that 10 years of work, I was leaving the Intersex Society of North America, and I was also quitting my tenured job at Michigan State because I'd had a child, and I was doing mainstream writing and mainstream speaking, et cetera, et cetera. It was just too much to handle. Some friends of mine offered me a part-time long-distance position at Northwestern University in the bioethics program, bioethics and medical humanities. So I took that job, and as I took that job, I ended up researching another controversy that I had not really meant to get into per se. And this was the Bailey book controversy. So Michael Bailey at Northwestern University is a psychology professor, and he had written a book in 2003 called The Man Who Would Be Queen. And it was a look at what he called feminine males. And among the other things he looked at people who transition from being male to being female, so people who are transgender women. And what he published in that book was considered very offensive by some transgender women. Now, I didn't really pay any attention when his thing blew up, because I was working with the intersex rights movement, not with transgenderism. They're different things. They have the same issues to some degree, but intersex is about being born with a body type that's in between. Transgender is about feeling that the body you have, the gender assignment assigned to you at birth is the wrong gender assignment, and that you'd need a different one to make sense of your life. So what ended up happening was a friend of ours introduced us, and Bailey, I assumed, was going to be a privileged white male homophobic jerk. And he was a privileged white male, but he turned out to actually not appear to be at all homophobic and also not to be a jerk. And so this was baffling to me, particularly since the friend introducing us was a gay man who seemed to be a very good judge of character. So not long after that, one of the people who had come after him when his book came out was invited to Northwestern to speak. And this was a person who was a transgender activist who I didn't really know anything about, but Bailey was upset that she was coming. And I said to him, I didn't really follow your controversy. What did she do? And he showed me what she had done, which was, among other things, put up pictures of his children online with their eyes blacked out, but they were identifiable, saying various things that were meant to be parodies of his book, including that perhaps their father had sodomized them. She had also gone after him at his departmental level, written letters to the department calling him an alcoholic and somebody who needed to be removed. She and a couple other people had basically gone after him full force. And so I was pretty shocked reading this stuff, and I wrote to the Rainbow Alliance at Northwestern that had invited her, and I said, you know, I didn't think this was good for academia, and I didn't think it was good for transgender rights. This person was completely out of control. They didn't answer me, so I blogged on it, and she came after me. And when that happened, the floodgates of mail opened. People started to write to me and say, how dare you, you know, Bailey's a transphobic jerk. Other people wrote to me and said, thank God somebody's speaking the truth. And these were coming from like all directions. And so as a historian, I was of course totally fascinated. Because as a historian, there's nothing more interesting than a story that you thought you understood that now seems to be completely different from everything everybody's been telling you. So I decided to try to research what had happened, particularly because we did have some characters in common from our history, and I found that really interesting. So I ended up spending the next year of my life looking at the Bailey book controversy. I interviewed about 100 people. I looked at about 1,000 sources. I spent a full year of research doing nothing but this. And I assumed it was going to be a he said, she said story. He was going to not have understood how he offended these people. These people were not going to understand how there needs to be academic freedom, blah, 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 right? But by the time I finished the year of research, it became clear to me that all of the charges that had been made against Bailey were in fact false. These were charges that included such things as he had done IRB-required research without IRB approval, that he had had sex with a transsexual research subject when she was his research subject, that he had lied about research, faked data, that he had been practicing clinical psychology without a license. I mean, illegal things. Any one of these really would have gotten you fired if they were true. So when I mapped it all out and discovered that, in fact, none of this was true, and that, in fact, the people who had made the charges knew none of it was true, then I had to decide whether to publish it or go hide. And having done all that work, I felt I had to publish it. But I knew they were going to come after me. And that was a very uncomfortable realization. So I did go ahead and publish it. I negotiated for it to be published in the Archives of Sexual Behavior. And I asked the editor, Ken Zucker, to make sure that the people I was making these charges against would have a chance to respond in the same journal article, same journal issue, because I felt it was important that they had that opportunity. And he went one better. He made it a target article, which meant anybody could respond. But of course, to do that meant the manuscript had to be released as a manuscript before it was published. And that meant it opened a window where it was not officially published, but it was out there in the open, and these people came after me full force. So this was 2008 when the Google algorithm was easier to manipulate. And these people were very, very good. A lot of them were computer experts. They were very good at manipulating the Google algorithms. And in the course of about 48 hours, my identity changed completely. From being a person who was an intersex rights advocate, an advocate for LGBT rights, somebody who was a leftist progressive, a feminist, to being somebody who wanted to put intersex people in the gas chambers, somebody who was an enemy of the LGBT population, a eugenicist, a Nazi. My favorite was a tool of the Catholic Church. That was my favorite because my parents are Catholics and they would have been delighted if I was a tool of the Catholic Church. They also started to do the same stuff, coming after my colleagues, coming after my family, and coming after my kid. And so this was very, very shocking and upsetting. And at that point, again, I had a choice, and the choice was to abandon this and to just move on in my life and take on some new project, or to dig in deeper. And I have that kind of personality that in my book, Ally's Middle Finger, I call the Galilean personality. It's the kind where you get something in your mouth and you will not let go, or you will not let go of the bone. You've got to have the bone, and so you've got to know what's going on. So instead of abandoning it, I ended up asking the Guggenheim for a fellowship to spend a year interviewing researchers to whom this kind of stuff had happened. And the Guggenheim gave me the fellowship. I am, by the way, probably the only person in history who's gotten letters of recommendation from Steve Pinker and Dan Savage. But the two of them supported it. And I went out and I started interviewing researchers all over the country who had been through this stuff. And most of them, it turned out, were white men, white straight men, able-bodied. And the reason for that was they made easier targets, but also they had the academic privilege to be able to put out daring arguments at some level, and so they got in more trouble. And I ended up interviewing not just them, but some women as well, but people who basically had gotten in trouble with identity politics activists for putting forth research that challenged standard narratives. And pretty much to a one, these people were either progressives or libertarians. They weren't conservatives or right-wings, and they certainly weren't eugenicists and Nazis the way they were constantly portrayed. But the people attacking them were people on the progressive side of the spectrum. And over again, I found the same kinds of stuff, which was that they were accused of things that were not true, but that the press picked up the claim and assumed that if the claim was made over and over again, the claim must have some validity to it. So there was this constant problem of being enveloped in smoke, looking like you were on fire. There was the problem of people using the same sorts of techniques constantly to go after them. There was a whole level of trauma among this population that had not been documented, and that, in fact, even I didn't document, because many of them were too proud to have me document it. There were an interview I did that led to enormous amounts of tears, but none of that appears in the book, because these were people who were both too proud but also didn't want their enemies to know that they had been broken. So I will tell you, though, there was at one point where Napoleon Chagnon said to me when we were at a conference together, "Damn it, Dreger, every time I'm with you, you make me cry." Like a girl, he said, like a little girl. And I said, "But Professor Chagnon, that's my claim to fame." So what I ended up doing was doing that book and finding that these people had been through ridiculous amounts of trauma, but also that people within academia were becoming very afraid of doing research in various kinds of areas because of the threat that they would be subject to these things, that they would have their administrators told that they had broken various rules, that they would be investigated over and over again, whether that was through IRBs or through Title IX, that they would be basically harassed. And so what I was finding was lots of academics who were actually shying away from research. And as a historian of science, this made me very, very upset, Because as a historian of science, I'm coming out of the long view of history, right? Looking at people like Galileo, and looking at people who, like Giordano Bruno, who was burned at the stake for being wrong about, supposedly wrong about, well, he was wrong, but burned at the stake for his ideas. So it was extremely worrisome to me to see this kind of situation where the left, which historically had promoted academic inquiry, which had been in many ways behind the movement towards democratic progress, was in fact working in a way to shut down further inquiry if it threatened their current concepts. So I began to become a strong advocate for academic freedom, and somebody who became confusing to everybody, because here I was on the left as a feminist working for the rights of people who appeared to supposedly be on the right, although many of them weren't. And I thought I was wrapping up the book and it was all going to be done when a case fell into my lap that ended up taking me 3 extra years to deal with. And this was the story in the last third of the book about something that happened back with Intersex, and I won't go deep into it, but I will tell you that it involved a prenatal treatment being used on intersex families that had a particular intersex condition running in it, where the attempt was to prevent intersex in the girls. I don't theoretically have any problem with the idea of preventing intersex if what it means is that you don't have some surgeon come at your genitals and mess with them. But in fact, in practice, this particular intervention was being claimed by the main researcher to be safe and effective when there was absolutely no evidence that it was safe and effective. And in fact, it's a prenatal treatment that involves a steroid that crosses the placental barrier and changes fetal development, because that's why they use it, is to cross the placental barrier and change fetal development. So it's like the most risky kind of drug you can possibly use according to standard medical ethics. But there was no research on it, basically. No controlled studies, no animal studies, no prospective long-term studies, and all of these families were being told it's safe and effective. Now that would have been upsetting enough, but this researcher was then going to the NIH and telling them, we don't know if this is safe or effective, so give me some money to study these families I've treated. So when I came upon this, because my colleagues had contacted me about it, I thought it was going to be pretty easy to fix, right? I thought, here really is an unethical researcher. Here really is one being challenged by the identity politics group that I'm with, but she really is doing something that's immoral, illegal, wrong, unscientific. So I thought it would be easy to call on the governmental systems, the FDA and the Office for Human Research Protections, and they would say, oh yeah, slam dunk, because all the evidence was there. And instead, all of those systems basically fell through. And it became increasingly clear to me that the reason they had fallen through is because what we were dealing with in academia, and you can see it today, is a system that is no longer primarily about the pursuit of truth. It's primarily about the pursuit of funding. Whether that's funding from donors or that's funding from the NIH or that's funding from a drug company, it's about the pursuit of money. And because this researcher continued to bring in the money, as long as she was bringing in the money, most people were turning the other way. In fact, those of you who, if any of you have had NIH funding, you'll love hearing this. When it turned out years before I came along, there was an NIH investigation. There was a Department of Justice investigation on her grants because there was so much evidence that there was financial misconduct as well as ethical misconduct. Cornell actually ended up firing her very quietly. And when she was fired by Cornell before she moved to Mount Sinai, she writes to the NIH and she says, this is a very hard time for me because I've lost my position and my money. Would you help me out? And they wrote her a merit award, a 6-figure merit award to tide her over till she could get another job, where she continued doing exactly the same thing until I came along a few years later and blew the whistle on it. So the book experience was this weird experience where I set out trying to write a book and instead I ended up living it. And what it really taught me was that we were living in a system where it wasn't just a situation that the left was paying attention to, which was the right in terms of government coming down and clamping down on what we could teach and what we could research and what we could say from places like Wisconsin and places like North Carolina. But it's also the left eating its own, insisting that if we were putting forth dangerous ideas, we had to be shut down. And now on top of that, you had this corporate mentality of the administrators where basically it's all about the money. So if it turns out you're a troublemaker and you're not bringing in the money, you get tossed. But if you're unethical and you're bringing in the money, you stay. And this all was brought home to me, finally, with the situation. I know some of you read about it in the Chronicle this week, if you hadn't heard about it previously, that led to my resignation at Northwestern, which involves a blowjob, so there's your trigger warning. I should say it's not one I gave. My husband says if that had been the case, I would have gotten a promotion. I know it's not an appropriate joke, but I'm a sex researcher. So what happened was I was asked at Northwestern to edit the new issue of the faculty journal that we put out, a journal called Atrium, and it was from the Medical Humanities Department. This is a medical humanities journal, right? It's stuff about liminality and power, stuff a lot of you would find stupid, but I find really interesting. And I was asked to edit the next issue, and the editor-in-chief decided that the next issue should be on the theme of bad girls, which to my mind was perfect for me. We all agreed it was perfect for me because I do feminist work. I deal with the issue of bad and good and gender and all these kinds of things. So I did the usual thing and sent out the call. We worked up a call for proposals together, sent it out, got back a bunch of proposals. And one of the pieces I got back, which I loved, and actually everybody who read it loved it, was a piece by disability studies and cultural anthropology scholar Bill Peace at Syracuse University. And Bill told the story of when he was 18 years old, and he had a neurological condition that was inborn. But at the age of 18, he became spinal cord injured, essentially, from the condition. So he no longer had the use of the lower part of his body in terms of control. So he ended up in a long-term rehabilitation hospital, because that's what existed in the 70s. Now, this is during the sexual revolution, it's during the drug revolution, and it's a different kind of rehabilitation hospital than we have today. It's a long-term one where basically the same nurses are there every day, the same patients are there every day, and they developed close relationships. Back then, there was less lines drawn in the way we have today. And he told the story of how he was going to doctors trying to get a sense of whether or not he was still going to be able to have sexual function. Was he going to be able to have sex? You know, he's 18 years old. He's a guy, right? Even a girl would want to know, am I going to be able to have sex? Am I going to be able to be a father? And they're not answering his questions. And so he tells the story of how one nurse helped him out one night and basically gave him fellatio to reassure him that it's okay, it works. You can ejaculate, you're going to be a father, you're going to be able to have sex, it's going to be pleasurable, it's going to be okay. And this is not a pornographic story that he told in this essay. The encounter begins with him having lost bladder control when he thought he had bladder control. As I said in the Chronicle piece, most Playboy stories don't begin with loss of bladder control, right? And a man weeping. That's not how most sex scenes start. But this was published in this essay, in this issue, and granted, I did go with his cheeky title, which was Head Nurses. But I like humor. I think we're grown-ups and we can handle humor. So this was published along with pieces in there about radical women who were ahead of their time, about women in sports and the ways that they're discriminated against, about transgender women in Samoa, about women who birth without the assistance of medical care who are considered radical. It was a very feminist, very challenging issue, like all of our issues were very challenging issues. And then I found out one day that our dean was very upset about the Head Nurses article and had decided to insist that it be censored. It was already published. 3,000 glossy issues had gone out. But he decided on the online version he wanted it taken down. And I literally had Galileo's middle finger in page proofs at this point. So my colleagues called me in and told me what was going on, and they said, shut up, shut up, shut up, don't say anything, we're going to try to fix it, because they know I'm kind of a big mouth. And I didn't want them getting fired because, as I joke in the Chronicle piece this week, but it's no joke, their health insurance depended on it, their jobs. Mine didn't, because I'm married to somebody who works at Michigan State, and his health insurance covers me. But their health insurance, their livelihoods depended upon this. So I kept it quiet and hoped that they could fix it. But month after month after month went by, and we weren't even telling Bill Peace what was going on. He just knew that the piece had disappeared offline, but he didn't know why. Finally, I couldn't take that anymore, so we told Bill Peace what was going on, and he was as outraged as I was. Because, ironically, his piece was about the silencing of people with disabilities and their sex lives. And here I had a doctor, who was my dean, silencing this man about the history of his sex life. The reason the dean had censored it, he said, and this is what I was told, I wasn't told by the dean, but I was told by the people in between us, that he had it withdrawn because our medical school had entered into a branding agreement with the hospital corporation of our medical hospital, and that he was afraid this might violate a branding agreement. So work that I had edited was being actively censored over a branding issue. It got worse. The dean decided that if we were to publish any additional issues of Atrium, it would be subject to a new committee, and the committee would consist mostly of people from the PR office and the dean's office. And they would decide what themes we could choose, what proposals we could accept, and what we could publish. We called it the censorship committee, right? Because there's no other name for it. It's a censorship committee. So we pushed and tried carefully inside to say, this is bad. Finally, my colleague Christy Kirshner, who is a rehabilitation physician and also was one of the contributors to the same issue of atrium, she had written about women with disability and their sex lives. She resigned over it. We went public with it and told people what was going on. Northwestern pretty much acknowledged it had happened, but still they refused to openly say that this had been censorship and to promise me that I had academic freedom and it would not happen again. I ended up speaking with the provost, and I said to him very clearly, I want acknowledgement that this was censorship and that it will not happen again, and they wouldn't give it to me. So after about 18 months after the original censorship occurred, I resigned very publicly. So again, I think people who are on the left in academia are paying a lot of attention, justifiably, to incursions from the right in terms of our academic freedom. People from the right are paying attention to what's going on with regard to things on the left, people on the left shutting people down. But what we're not paying attention to is the ways in which the corporatization of universities is taking all of that and using it to make sure that we all behave ourselves in ways that don't upset the people in power, which is the well-paid administrators, the trustees who are controlling our universities. So this is where the problem of stupid comes in. What we no longer have, I'm afraid, in university systems is a concept that what we are really supposed to be there about is the pursuit of truth. You know, we used to talk about lux and veritas, right? Light and truth, as being what we were pursuing. Now we really do have these little corporate branding slogans. We will discover the promise, fulfilling the dream. All of these expensive little slogans that have been designed with expensive new remakes of our mascots and expensive decisions about what color code we're going to use on our letterhead, and then lots of messages about staying on message. When we think about what universities are supposed to be, we should fundamentally reject the concept of a brand. Because what a brand is about a singular message. If you look at any marketing textbook, that's what it'll tell you. It's about a singular message that is meant to constantly remain focused so that you build up equity on the marketing. That's what a brand is. That is exactly the opposite of what a university should be. A university should be a place where there is no singular message, where there is no requirement to stay on a message, where in fact we value the fact that we don't have any organized message. We have disorganization. We have dangerous concepts. You know, what I often try to point out to people on the left in academia is the reason I'm wearing pants and lecturing men is because of dangerous people who came before me, right? Women and men who pushed for the rights of women before me. And yet what we have now is this increasing attitude that somehow we're supposed to put up with what the administration lets us know is acceptable or unacceptable. So part of the problem of stupid is that we've allowed ourselves to get into this system where we're no longer really about intellectualism. We really are, as the speaker said earlier, increasingly about our sports teams. We are about our logos. We are about the PR of the university system. As one colleague said to me recently, Frank Fear at Michigan State, it's no longer the case that universities have football teams. Football teams have universities. And what troubles me deeply is that I see a lot of this stupid leaking down to the faculty. So I see a problem where we have a failing of standards in a lot of disciplines, where disciplines that maybe I'm just getting old and I'm saying kids these days, but I don't think so. I think a lot of disciplines that used to have a high degree of academic rigor no longer do, in part because we have this enormous pressure to get external funding. And how do you get external funding? By constant production, production, production. How do you do constant production? You don't worry that much about quality. You simply don't worry too much about quality. You just keep pumping it out. So one of the things I see, for example, is a near total lack of fact-checking among academics of their publications. This is not so true in legal scholarship, where there is, from what I've seen, a fair bit of fact-checking. Mathematics is one of the areas, too, where I see a bit of fact-checking. History is one of the areas. But so many errors are introduced into the scholarly literature today because people are moving too fast to be able to care about the issue of standards and rigor. You add to this culture of celebrity that we've been talking about. You have a situation where universities highly value their celebrity faculty. I know because I was one. I was one of those celebrity faculty, right? I was the darling. I write for the New York Times. I write for the Atlantic. I'm on television shows all the time. I know what that was like. And the students have the same feeling that what they want is the celebrity, right? They want to bring in Milo, or they want their professor to be on the news. So what the university system wants is people that will be glossy and pretty and make the university look good. But what they don't want is research projects that take 10 years to pan out and maybe never do pan out, because that's the way basic research turns out to be. So we have this system where the faculty are basically today, to my mind, treated as car salesmen. We are judged by how much money we're bringing in for the company, and if we don't bring enough money in, we're out. Who's the customer? Well, sometimes we're told the customer are the students, sometimes the customers are the trustees, but whoever it is, they're right, and we have to do whatever we have to do to sell them the product. And again, if we're not bringing in enough money, it's all over. So this, to me, is a real concern, because we need academia to be a place that continues to care about the pursuit of truth and continues to care about intellectual rigor. Yet all over the place, I see signs that intellectual rigor is failing, and that, in fact, what we're supporting is more like a sales system of branding and gloss and celebrity. What can we do in terms of trying to change this culture? Part of what we have to work on is so hard. Job security, right? If we don't have job security, then people can't do things that are dangerous. They can't go into dangerous research concepts. They can't do risky teaching. So job security is a huge one, yet that's very difficult to deal with when we're in a situation where universities are working strongly against job security. I think another thing we really have to work on is teaching. Teaching is not something that is rewarded, but it's also something that we pay remarkably little attention to in many cases. So we have a situation where we blame our students for being incapable of dealing with difficult concepts or difficult dialogue. But what are we doing in the classroom to make sure we promote that? And I know some of you have talked about what you're doing, and I think that's great. But many of us are just lecturing because we're in large classes where basically we're in large classes because it's economically more feasible for the university. And as a consequence, there's no opportunity to do the kinds of intensive teaching that is really required to get students up to the point we need them to be at to understand how to have rational disagreement and rational arguments. In my own teaching, I've used lots of techniques. Basically, so I've not only had a kid, I've had a bunch of pet rats because of my kid. And I'm convinced humans are mammals. And basically, they respond to rewards and punishments. And so I've thought about my students over the years and realized my students tend to be very high-achieving students. And the consequence of that is they respond to whatever I'm assessing. But we don't think about the fact that assessment is where the teaching is happening. So we give them Scantron tests, and then we hope they're capable of rational disagreement. How does a Scantron test teach them rational disagreement? What I've done in my own classes is, for example, have part of the grade dependent on actively disagreeing with somebody else in class once a class. So I've had a system where participation isn't just you talk, it's you respond to somebody and not me. You respond to somebody else in the class, and you get extra points if you constructively critique them. But another problem, I think, is that we tend to teach product instead of teaching methodology. And again, part of the reason we're doing this is because the pressure is on us to get external funding. And teaching becomes a side thing that you have to get out of the way to get to what really matters to the university, which is research and external funding. But if you take the time to actually work with students, one of the things you start to do is, instead of teaching the answers, you teach the process of getting to the answers, and that's a completely different way of teaching. So when I started teaching at Michigan State in the 90s, I was teaching sex and gender to a bunch of pre-med science undergrads who were from the Midwest. So they were very tense about sex and gender and sexuality because these were nice Midwestern kids who had not really even had any sex ed. So one of the things I tried with them was to, instead of giving them a syllabus, I gave them a thing I called the owner's manual. And I told them, I don't want you to learn particular things. I want you to own this course and learn how to learn in a class like this. So one of the things that I impressed upon them was that everybody in the class was going to have a different experience, and that was okay. And it was perfectly safe for everybody to have a totally different experience. At the end of the class, we did one thing where we actually created a cognitive map on the floor, and I had them put flags down in different places to talk about what the experience was like going to these different concepts. And it became vividly clear to them that they had all had a completely different experience in this class. And that was okay. And that allowed them to go on to other classes and to recognize, you know what, when you and I are in a class on evolution, we're going to have different experiences, even though it's the same teacher and the same textbook. So what are we doing in our teaching to help our students understand that this is all different? So just to bring that home, I want to talk about courage and kinship. I think that one of our tendencies when we're dealing with something like free speech issues on campus is to engage in the particular dyad of the moment. Somebody's acting in a way that we think is lacking in a basic core concept of a principle, in this case, free speech. So we want to get into the argument with them. And those things are important, and FIRE does it brilliantly in terms of, and they certainly helped me, they've helped everybody I've ever sent to them. They are really good at that strategic hit to help people. But for those of us who are still on campuses, we have to do something bigger than that. We have to work on trying to change the culture the way people here have been talking about. And I think to do that, we have to do more than do the engagement when the fire, when a flare breaks out, right? We have to do more than just deal with the problem when it flares up. That's important to do, but we have to do more than that. And I think the way we do that is to think about courage in a different way. So I told you that I've had to think a lot about courage because people misattribute it to me. I finally got to thinking about the basic concept of courage. When we talk about somebody who is really brave, we talk about somebody who, for example, throws themselves in front of harm to protect another person. Or we talk about the person who goes into a burning building to pull somebody out. If you throw yourself in front of your child, or you run into your burning house to save your child, nobody calls you brave. That's a normal thing to do. Saving your child is just human. The moment at which they're called brave is when you do that for a stranger. So to my mind, what courage looks like is a concept of kin that is more generous, that goes beyond the people who are our immediate family or our immediate friends or our immediate departmental colleagues, but instead recognizes that putting ourselves out there for people who are not really in our group in any emotional sense, but who are effectively strangers or maybe even enemies, but putting ourselves out there for them because that's what it means to be good, is what it really means to be courageous. And so I want to encourage you as you do this work to not just take care of the obvious people around you, the people who are your favorite students or your favorite colleagues or your friends or your departmental mates, but to push yourself and to say, here is this person on campus who is a shithead saying stupid things. But in this instance, I need to step up and say, I think these things being said are stupid, but I want to talk about the general principle at stake here. And I want to talk about the whole community and the needs of the whole. And I want to bring us to that larger principle and talk about what we have in common in terms of our need to take care of each other. And part of that is to think historically, think in terms of our own lineage, beyond our immediate selves, to think about the larger lineage of the human population and the experiences we have had with suppression and censorship. to think about, for example, McCarthyism, which is not taught to most students today. To think about the free speech movement of the 70s, which is not taught to most students today. To help students understand that part of why they feel like they can shut us down is because they're insanely privileged. The truth is, they can shut us down because they're not actually in a struggle where there are huge stakes. So let's try to help them see internationally, historically, places where this stuff really is big stakes, where journalists are being actively murdered by the state, where people who are radical academics are being actively arrested, where historically people were blacklisted and had their jobs taken away from them because of the concept that their ideas were too dangerous. Let us take that to them and try to encourage our colleagues, too, to think about that bigger kinship, the thing we all have in common. And I think that if we do that, that is where we begin to find a common courage to put up with difference and disagreement, to try to do it for the greater good. Thank you.
But can you please just elaborate a little bit about what you do to encourage students in your classes to feel like they can respond to you, that they can disagree, that they can be courageous?
Yes, I make them read completely outrageous texts that are incredibly offensive. And I present it as if it's a normal text. So, for example, I present eugenics texts that make the argument that stupid poor people should not breed, and because it would be a bad idea. Because, for heaven's sakes, we breed cows carefully, and we breed corn carefully. Why would we not breed humans carefully? And I present this to them like this is a perfectly rational thing. And it takes them about 5 minutes before they break and start yelling at me. I also talked in the Chronicle article about how one day I accidentally assigned an article that advocated pedophilia. That was the one that really taught me the value of assigning a text which was completely upsetting. And, do I give my students warnings? Well, to some degree, at the beginning of class, I say we're going to encounter some stuff which is really uncomfortable. Actually, one of the most uncomfortable texts I assigned for years for my history of medicine students at Northwestern was a text that on the surface looked perfectly reasonable. It was a text which was about how to keep people in a long-term research study. And it was by a nurse, and it made the argument that you should value what they value. You should ask them what matters to them and give them things from the study that matter to them, that you should treat them like people, that you should listen to them and know their names and attend to them. And it was written by the nurse who kept all those men in the Tuskegee study for 40 years. So, and really, the whole text is beautiful. It's all about caring about people. It's a very powerful text to use. So these are the kinds of things I like to stick at my students. I've always wanted to push things, right? So shortly after Anita Hill happened, you will all recall, if you're old enough, universities started putting out these really crazy sexual harassment policies. And the original sexual harassment policies were nuts. Well, Northwestern still is, but they were nuts. And they said things like, you could not discuss sex in class. You could not show pictures of naked people, which when I'm teaching intersex, I need to show pictures of naked people. So when this policy came out at Michigan State and I was teaching a class on sex and gender, I took the sexual harassment policy and I circled all the things I was about to violate, and I gave it to my chair, and I said, I'll be violating the following things. And then I brought it to class and I said, I'm going to be violating the following things. Let's discuss this policy so that you understand where I'm about to violate it all and why. And we had a great discussion from that. So, I think bringing in the challenging stuff and having that discussion and allowing your students to recognize that you can be wrong is very powerful. And that's part of it, right? We have to model being wrong. I spend time with my students showing them places where I went down a research path that went nowhere, or I went down a research path with such a heavy bias I missed a really key source. Show them the method of mistakes, and I think that changes them. We're no longer, then, to them, these sort of perfect intellectuals. We're people who are human, who screw up, who have biases, and we can talk about that. And I think most students respond very well to it, in my experience. I used to do stuff that would get me in complete trouble now. I used to give my students extra credit for cross-dressing. Some of them really enjoyed it and got way too much extra credit. But I did it in part because I thought this was something that would be useful for them to consider doing. And they didn't have to do it. You know, one of the things I used to do regularly was in my course on sex and gender, I would give them tours of the bathroom. I would have the men go into the women's bathroom with me. We'd make sure first it was empty, but we'd go into the women's bathroom, and we would examine the physical structure of the women's bathroom, which is completely different from the men's bathroom. And they would become fascinated, like, what are these little garbage cans in the stalls? And why can't we have one of those, the men would say. I would like a little garbage can in the stall. And then they would see the menstruation bench, which used to be in every women's bathroom, and they would say, how come they get a bench and we don't get a bench? You know, and we would have these really powerful discussions, and every now and then my chair would wander in and be like, oh, they took over the bathroom again. You know, and I'd say, I'm teaching, get out of here, I'm teaching. You know, but it was stuff like that that I think today would get me probably, you know, sent absolutely to the administration. But I would still do it if I hadn't had to resign. I mean, I would still be pushing. The more we push, the more of us there are. Yeah.
Alice,
yes, John.
Sorry. I want to ask you about professors getting in trouble, and particularly about the case of Michael Bailey, because you take an approach, and I take a very different approach to his case. And
which of his cases?
His cases, and because one thing you didn't mention, that people should know, that Michael Bailey, he was never punished by Northwestern for all the attacks by left-wing activists, but he was eventually punished, almost fired, and had his human sexuality course banned, still banned, because of attacks by conservatives for his controversial actions in teaching. And it seems to me, from my perspective, you know, I can't really see a way of how you solve the problem of people making criticisms and attacks, even though it's very upsetting and traumatic for people. What I see, though, is the bigger problem is what universities do when they punish people, and that's the thing we can solve. And I'm wondering, do you have a different perspective on that? Is it just because you were researching his case before he was actually punished that you focus on that part of it? Or do you see that traumatic aspect as more important than the punishment?
I don't think Bailey was punished by conservatives. I think Bailey was punished for the brand. So what Bailey finally got in trouble with, he was teaching his human sexuality class for years, which was extremely popular. It had like 600 students in it, which to my mind is not the best way to teach. But very popular course. And after class, he would sometimes offer these sort of additional sessions, which were totally optional, and students could come, but they would have speakers of various stripes. So, for example, there was an annual gay guys panel where a bunch of gay guys would answer questions from students about what it's like to be a gay man, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the thing that finally got him in trouble was he had a pair of exhibitionists come in to talk about their sex lives. And it turned out they decided to do some exhibitionism in class. So they used the man used on the woman a device called a fuck saw. That's a rigorous term. I'm not swearing. And what it is it's a combination of a reciprocating saw with a dildo on top, which requires, I guess, going to Michael's and going to Home Depot. I don't know. As I said in my book, I can't really explain it. I've never had the pleasure. So he wasn't expecting them to do this, and then they did this, and they asked him permission quickly, and he said yes, stupidly, and they did this in the Ryan family auditorium at Northwestern University, and the Ryan family was none too pleased. But it was more, what ended up happening, interestingly, the students never made a complaint. The students who came to this optional thing were told, you know, that this was going to happen. They could leave if they want. It wasn't required for class. It wasn't even in class. None of them had a problem with it. What happened was it leaked out of class to the Northwestern Daily newspaper, which is the student newspaper, a few weeks later. And then it got picked up by CNN. And that's when everything went crazy. And it wasn't because the students were upset. Nobody was upset about it. It was because the university was embarrassed. And that's when the university clamped down on Bailey, because they were embarrassed by the story. And that's why they decided to go after him at that point, was because of embarrassment. So to my mind, I don't really know that he was attacked by conservatives. I'm not even sure Mike would describe it that way. I think what he would say is the administration was worried about the way Northwestern's reputation looked, and they got upset because of the reputational issue. By the way, it's worth remembering, Northwestern is also the place, not only where Laura Kipnis had the same crappy experience that I did with the administration, but it's also the place where the football team tried to unionize, and the administration fought them. What was the union fighting for, the students who were trying to unionize fighting for? They were basically fighting to try to be treated like human beings adequately paid as workers, and to be treated as students. They were fighting for the very things that anybody looking at the way sports works in academia would fight for. These were reasonable young people doing a very noble thing, trying to change the NCAA system, and Northwestern shut them down. Why? Because Northwestern lets the football team rule, not the team rule, but it allows the football program essentially to have control of the university because that's part of the university corporatization and branding system. I don't think it's a coincidence that all these things happen in Northwestern. This is a place that leads in terms of corporatization. It's a place that in the medical school, by the way, changed tenure so that it's no longer a 7-year clock, it's an 11-year clock. They want 2 R01s out of you before you get tenure. This is a place that is really about the model that is chew you up and spit you out like modern times in that way. So, not a coincidence.
Well, yeah, thank you for the talk. I plan to steal several of your ideas in the future, but I'll attribute so there won't be theft. And I love how you sort of painted a picture of a utopian university, which is really what I think all of us each one of us is really striving for, where if you sort of prime students and get them used to the fact that, wow, this is interesting, and yet it's sort of forbidden, that it stretches their minds, and it's sort of the Nietzschean thing about what doesn't kill you makes you stronger in a certain kind of sense. Did you find, though, that was harder to do over the years, as students may have changed?
Yes, and we were talking about this over drinks earlier.
Right.
Yes, about 5 years ago, things started, it felt like 5 to 10 years ago, things started to shift. And I do think it started to shift. But that said, my experience is, as I go around to universities still and occasionally end up as a fellow teaching for short periods of times in universities, my experience is the majority of students want to be intellectually pushed.
I agree.
They really are there to learn. The majority of them, when awakened by intellectual stimulation, respond very positively and in fact want that from their
Right, that was my
classes.
experience too. And especially if you have a smaller class, you can work on them and create that kind of environment. And the
Class
question
size
making
is
it
one of
larger.
those things we absolutely have to be
Right.
working on. And
But it can also work in bigger classes if you have the right kind of model, I think.
It can. In
Tougher.
fact, there was a class at Michigan State that I taught that was a history of medicine class that had 80 students, and every
Right.
class was a discussion. I never did a
Right.
lecture. I did a discussion with 80 students a different way all the time. I learned all of their names by the second day because I used a special technique I had. We did an 80-person discussion class, but it was a lot harder than if it had been 30.
Did a student ever complain?
What's that?
Did a student ever complain?
Not in that class, no.
Yeah, that's great. And there's so much, we talked about administrations today and the priming we give students when they come in for orientation. Now think if they were primed according to your notion of what education should be, that would be, that's where we should start probably. How do we do that?
Well, the other thing I did in my classes was I figured out, because assessment is where learning happens. Students who are good students will respond to whatever you're assessing. That's just the way they are. They're rats. They're us. We respond to assessment. We're normal. And so one of the things I did in my classes was to develop a system where basically students could get higher grades if they did more better work. And so rather than having a system where students felt like they were on a curve where some had to get C's and some had to get A's, I had a system where all could get D's or all could get A's if they just did the work. And that meant more work for me, because once I presented that system, they saw a path to getting a good grade, but the path was a hard path. It was a difficult path, but it was purposely a difficult path to get them there. And so they would work and work and work and work, and that was really exciting to me. And I had an administrator at one point ask me why I was giving away so many A's. And I said, do you want to come see my grading? And my grading stack was like enormous because my students were doing so much work to get to that point, but they were really engaged because I did give them an owner's manual and not a syllabus, and they felt like the owner's manual explained to them how to get to that point they wanted to get to. It explained what my objectives were. It explained how to argue with me. It explained, rather than having the standard disability policy, my disability policy was, if some way in which I'm teaching is causing you to have a disability, come talk to me so I can change the way I'm teaching. Rather than saying, if you have a disability that needs an accommodation, speak to me. I said, if my teaching is causing a disability for you, come talk to me and I'll figure out how to change my teaching. And sometimes that meant, for example, audio learners, right? We figured out ways that we could record, whatever it was. I tried to keep reminding myself that the point of the classroom was not the imparting of knowledge, it was the growth of the student. Right? So the one thing I learned really carefully from this, and I'm sorry I forget her name, but she was a middle school teacher in the Bronx, and she said this thing that changed my life in terms of teaching. She said, teaching is mostly listening, and learning is mostly talking. And that radically changed the way I taught when I realized that is true. The way most students get to the point of learning is they have to articulate what it is they know, and they have to get themselves to the point where they can articulate what they know and don't know. So it changed the way I taught to take the focus off of my imparting of knowledge instead of trying to just listen to them and figure out how do I get them to get to the point where they can articulate knowledge, where they can articulate methodology, where they can articulate questions, and they can articulate what they don't know. And the other thing I do in my grading, well, back when I was able to teach, was I constantly had in my assignments the question, what do you still not know? And my students would list all the stuff they still didn't know. And they would say to me at the end of the class, they would say, how come there's so much I don't know, Alice? And I would say, because I let you recognize that there's so much you don't know. And I'd remind them of the old saying, right? When you get a BS, you think you know everything. When you get your master's, you think you know everything. And when you get your PhD, you realize you don't know anything. Nobody knows anything. Yeah. The expression is when you get your bachelor's, you think you know everything. Oh, learning is mostly talking, and teaching is mostly listening. So teaching is mostly listening. And, you know, boy, I'm so glad I learned that before I had a kid. Because it turns out if you do that with children, they learn a huge amount if you just shut up. If you just listen and occasionally say something. It's amazing how much learning occurs. And think about it yourself, right? When do you learn the most? I bet it's when you write your papers. That's when I learn huge amounts, is when I write something down. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, that's what I know, and that's what I know, and that's what I know. It's because you have to do that articulation. And I think we're not doing enough of that. Instead, we have a system where we, unfortunately, teach students that X, Y, and Z are true, as opposed to, here is how we try to get to the truth. And so when they yell at us what they think is true, well, that's what they've been taught in a lot of their classes. You know, students are very prone, as is the rest of America, to generalizations. One of the things that drove me absolutely crazy in my classes at Michigan State early on was my students would say, society does this, and society does that. So one day, I had the students sit in a big circle, and I put a chair in the middle, and I said, could those of you who are society please sit in that chair, because we'd like to blame you for a lot of stuff. You're homophobic, you're sexist, you're racist, you're terrible. Could those of you who are society please go sit over there? And none of them did. And some of them said, but I am kind of sexist, and I am kind of homophobic. And I said, I know, right? But you're kind of that. And some of us are kind of that. And some of us are kind of this. So could we stop? So I banned the word society in my class, and it became a college-wide legend. Dr. Dreger won't let you use the word society. How can you write a paper? This is what they said. How can I write a paper without talking about society? But they started qualifying what they said. They would, and I would say, if you think this person is homophobic, quote them and say who they are. Do accountability, right? Do credit and accountability. Tell me who made this comment. And that gave them media literacy at a level they'd never had before. Suddenly they realized, oh, The Gap is sexist, or CoverGirl is homophobic, or whatever it is. Right? But they could look at specific things and begin to express things in specific ways and no longer come to me with these grandiose claims about discrimination being somehow universal, but it's always somebody else doing it, it's never me. They would start to own it.
I had a question, and you know, obviously I'm Robert Shibley. I'm the executive director of FIRE, and you know, obviously our business is rabble-rousing to a certain extent, which is partly what we're doing with this conference. I think it's fair to say is getting people, you know, to network, and we've had a couple of talks about, you know, standing up for one another. I guess one of the questions I had was, one of the things that FIRE has discovered over the years is like there has to be sort of a credible, you know, you have to persuade, you know, persuasion is the most important thing. That's what changes people's minds. But there also has to be sort of a credible threat in some cases. In our case, when it's violating the First Amendment, for instance, that's to be like, well, there has to be some risk that eventually it's going to come down and you're going to get sued. Faculty-wise, you know, I think traditionally we sort of think of the AUP and sort of the unionization process as that that way that it's exercised when it comes to academic freedom. At least that's sort of how I've thought of that. But I don't really think there's any real prospect of like an academic freedom strike like happening anytime soon. Without, unless there is one, I mean, how can faculty like sort of exercise their power? I mean, we talk about shared governance, and we've been struggling with that at a lot of different universities. Harvard right now is going through a whole sort of convulsion over that. Why, from an administrative perspective, they've arrogated so much power to themselves. How can faculty start to take that back in a way that is realistic and could actually happen? Or am I just, because I would love to see the faculty be like, you know what, no, we're not doing it, because as I've told a number of people, nobody goes to the college because they heard the administration was really awesome. Like, that's the one. They might go for the football team, they might go for the students, they might go for the faculty. They're not going for the secondary deputy dean of whatever.
So one of the things that faculty can do is demand more say in who is hired into the administration. In the past, in academia, most administrators came from our own ranks. What's happened is the corporate model where we hire from outside and we hire people with MBAs increasingly and not people with PhDs. And part of what we have to do to take back is to make sure that the people at the top are our people who are genuinely faculty, who get it, who have lived what we've lived, who value what we value. The only way to take back academic governance is to either sacrifice yourself to it and recognize it's not only not rewarded, it's generally punished, or to change the reward system, which is difficult, but in some places has been done, to reward people for doing academic governance. In the past, we used to be rewarded for it. Now people are rewarded much less for it because the administration doesn't actually want smart, capable people doing it. Yeah, but the service doesn't count for much. And what they want out of service nowadays is often external service to the culture, because that gives good PR, as opposed to or internal service, it's the scut work kind of stuff. But if we want, so one of the things that happened, and I don't think the administration purposely did this, but it ended up this way, right? The administration increasingly valued external funding. And when that happened, people who in the past used to spend part of their time doing academic governance recognized that was not being rewarded. And so the people who ended up staying in academic governance tended to be the deadwood, tended to be the people who didn't have research programs, tended to be people who were not, in some cases, not particularly spectacular teachers. They were doing it because they were not doing too much of the other stuff and were not very motivated. So we ended up with a sort of stereotypical faculty in academic governance, which is the grouchy old professor who wants to talk about some gripe from 35 years ago, right? In fact, often that person actually has an incredible institutional memory and knows things that are incredibly useful and understands why we got to this particular policy. But that said, I think if we really want to have faculty taking back academic governance, we're going to have to recreate this reward system and recognize it as rewarded. It is possible to have uprisings. We had one at Michigan State when I was there in 2004. The administration tried to move the medical school from East Lansing to Grand Rapids. They also, gosh, there were two other things. Oh, they were closing, it sounds crazy, but they were going to close the College of Arts and Letters. And there was one other thing that I forget. And what happened there was that a group formed, Faculty Voice formed. I was one of the people who was in that group. There were about 35 of us who were very active. And we had to bring together the Faculty Senate, which had not met in 15 years. And in order to get the academic senate to have a quorum, we had to have 600 faculty show, because Michigan State's a big place. I mobilized, this was before social media, right, in a big way. So we had to mobilize. So I had a team of students that basically were willing to work with me on this, and they papered the entire campus to let the faculty know that this was going on and we really needed them to be there. The faculty showed up. We had 900 faculty show up in an auditorium. We took 3 votes, which were resolution votes. All 3 of them passed by voice vote without a single dissent. 900 faculty. That was a very clear message to the administration that we were serious. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. And the administration was scared shitless in a very useful way. They did not close the College of Arts and Letters, and they moved the administration of the medical school to Grand Rapids, but they did not move the medical school itself. The medical school is still half in Grand Rapids. Well, it's now partly in Flint, partly in Grand Rapids, and partly in East Lansing. And I should disclose, my husband was in Faculty Voice, and he was punished by being made an administrator shortly after that, which is why, ironically, I'm able to do what I do because I sleep with an administrator. But I didn't set out to do that, and I don't feel good about that part of it, I have to say. I feel very dirty.
Hi. I just wanted to know if you could comment a little bit on if you think there's a connection between just the growth of the administration and bureaucracy. So if there's just so many, so we say like the administration, but it's a lot bigger now. And so if you feel like there's more micromanaging, or there's just a lot of deans and provosts and these weird titles, then they're just looking for stuff to do. And I don't know if you have experience, or if you could just comment on that. If you think the ratio to faculty and administration is just gotten out of whack,
Yes.
and maybe we need to cut administration.
Yes.
Okay.
I have to say, having been married now to a medical school administrator for 10 years, it is remarkable to me that there's often no money to do anything, but if the administration needs another staff member, suddenly there's another staff member. There never seems to be a lack of money for hiring more staff for the administration. And I find that very troubling. And I'm not sure how to fix that, but it does seem to me that this is part of the problem, is that we have very administration-heavy systems right now. I sometimes look at those administrator salaries and think, wow, I could get like 3 classes out of that would reduce in size, that would have really excellent instructors. We could get tenure stream lines out of this money, but that's often not happening. They want us, I do think contingent faculty is a more useful term than adjunct, but I refer to people who are contingent as tenuous faculty. I think it more vividly creates a contrast to tenured, right? Tenuous. Because that's how I felt. I didn't feel just contingent. I felt tenuous the whole time I was at Northwestern. I was at Northwestern, by the way, doing this incredibly risky work for years and years, and I never had tenure there. I never was on a tenure line there. I was fully promoted, but I was part-time, and there was no tenure position for me because it was a part-time position, and they don't do part-time tenured positions. I did all of that and I did all this risky work. I had the FDA mad at me. I had Cornell's medical school mad at me. I had Mount Sinai's medical school mad at me. I had the Office for Human Research Protections mad at me. I had the American Journal of Bioethics mad at me. I had the transgender activist community mad at me. Nobody made me go away until I published an article about a blowjob that violated a branding agreement. And then I got in trouble. And that had to do with the administration changing. The guys before me, I found out when I left, one of them who knew me well came to me and said, you had no idea how many times we got called and told, fire that woman. And I said, you're right. You guys never told me. And you did the right thing. Your job was to tell those people, she has academic freedom, go away. And that's exactly what they did. They protected me for years. But when the administration changed and the medical school entered into this corporatization agreement, that's when things changed. That's when my research budget suddenly disappeared, for example, where even though it was coming from my salary, I had to tell them, that's my salary you're taking away right there. Suddenly, people like me were considered unimportant. They told me I was, what was the term they used? Some kind of extraneous thing. And I said, have you Googled me? Because you're paying me a 20% FTE, and if you Google me, you might be surprised at what you're getting for that 20% FTE in terms of high-quality work that's very visible. But, yeah, no, they protected me for years. And until that branding agreement came along and the corporatization approach came, I didn't get in trouble for all that stuff I did, which had hugely powerful people angry at me. What got me in trouble was one instance of fellatio in 1978 that I did not even participate in.
So everything you said, I want to rewind and talk about your teaching for a moment. Everything you said about your teaching, I think, is fascinating and awesome. And from what you said and from what I've heard, I think you're a great teacher. And I think people in this room would think that. There are people here who are experts on teaching, et cetera. I've won a teaching award myself, et cetera. But what happens, and what if a professor ends up in the position of a student complaining, especially when you do fairly radical, different teaching methods such as you do? Say you get some, in this newer generation, you get some complaints. Now the administration, let's assume the administration gets upset, and the administration says, we don't really like what she's doing in her classroom, it's upsetting some students. There was a dildo involved. That's all we know. How then, especially when you teach in some areas as you're teaching where there's not some sort of ultimate objective assessment at the end, how does someone in that position who's been challenged, and if the administration, say, tendentiously wants to go after a professor like that, how do you then defend your teaching? If they want to tendentiously go after it, what do you do? How do you justify it?
I think the current teaching environment is radically bad compared to the way it was 20 years ago. I think there's no question. It's dangerous and it's for teachers and it's bad. But one of the things that I always did was to be very transparent about the ways that I was being challenging. So, for example, I'm not kidding. I took the sexual harassment policy, circled it, and gave it with a copy of my owner's manual to my chair and said, this is what I'm doing in class, and you need to know I'm showing pictures of naked people in class, and you need to know students might be talking about their own sexual histories. I'm not going to stop them if they decide to do that, right? Because we're talking about a sexuality class. And one of the things the policy said was that students cannot talk with other students or faculty about their sexual histories. Well, that meant that my gay students couldn't come out as gay in my class. That struck me as ridiculous, right? You're telling me that in 1995, a student who's gay can't say I'm gay because that reveals his sexual history or her sexual history. So it's bad, and I think one of the ways you try to protect yourself is to do transparency as much as possible as to why you're doing what you're doing in the classroom and to keep informing people about what you're doing. But, are there going to be some students who are going to see it as an opportunity, frankly, to use power against you? Yes. And over the years, I had some of those students, right? But what I did was make sure that my departmental administration in particular knew exactly what I was doing so that when a student did that and tried to pull a power move on me, they recognized it for what it was, which was often, frankly, a student with a narcissistic person. I'm not kidding. This was often a student with a narcissistic personality disorder who would be attention-seeking no matter what. And if they couldn't get enough attention one way, they would come after you in the negative way. If they couldn't absorb all of the attention in the room in the classroom in a positive way, they would come after me in a negative way. And, it was frustrating sometimes, but we dealt with that stuff, and I felt very supported by my administration. And it did help that I got teaching awards from the students every single year. Every single year I was voted Teacher of the Year in that program for 7 years in a row. And that provided me, I think, also some degree of protection in that way. But yeah, when I look back at the things I was doing then, I'm not sure I would do them today. But at the same time, I can see why those students are still in touch with me, right? So when I got married, my friends were scandalized, and I was a feminist, so I wasn't going to wear a white dress, because really, who was I kidding? So I wore a red wedding dress, which in Indiana was kind of radical. But when I was teaching at Michigan State, when I would talk about feminism and I would talk about the virginity valuing of females, I would wear my wedding dress to school. And it would be this big red thing, right? And the students would talk with me about, and we'd have that conversation. When I would talk about birth, I would get up on the table and demonstrate birth in the lithotomy position versus birth in the squatting position. And we'd have those conversations. And I think that it was the way in which I was making clear to them that we were in an intense intellectual relationship together that allowed most of them to be very respectful and very trusting of that kind of concept. But part of what we do, right, is we act like that intellectual relationship is somehow supposed to be non-emotional. And the truth is, a good teaching relationship sometimes gets kind of emotional. And I think we don't talk about that and we don't deal with it because what we've been told is that being in an emotional relationship with our students is inappropriate. But the truth is, when you are in an intense teaching moment, it gets really emotionally intense sometimes, right? When students are reading something that is blowing their minds, they're having an emotional reaction. And if they're doing that and they're opening themselves up to that, I'm having an emotional reaction back, which is I respect that they're putting themselves there. So maybe we're at the point where we need to have that conversation with our administrations where we talk about the fact that teaching is a vulnerable relationship. It is, by its very definition, a power differential and a vulnerable situation. So how are we going to deal with that? And I think the way to deal with that is not to pretend it never happens. It does happen. And forget the fact that we never even talk about the fact that the intellectual sometimes becomes erotic in interesting ways. We can't possibly talk about that because that would be way too dangerous for us to talk about because our students, we're not supposed to talk about that at all.
Like for the purposes of time, I'm going to give the microphone to Angus and then to Andrew. And then I think from there, we're going to take the conversation to the bar all the way over here. I'm going to give, let Alice take a break and get a drink. We've got the bar till 10 with a tab of, I don't remember what it is. If you all get within $500 of it, that'll be some properly reckless drinking that we do in the next 45 minutes.
Is that a dare?
I won't say it isn't. But in the meantime, Angus and then Andrew, and then we will wrap things and continue on into however long.
So you just said the state of teaching is bad at the moment, and we all know that the state of administration is bad, and you can't throw a dead cat without somebody telling you that the state of students is really bad right now. So my question is, what about the current state of academia excites you right now? What about this historical moment in higher education makes you feel either excited about what's happening now or optimistic about the future?
The fact that the Chronicle of Higher Education is talking about core principles every single issue, which wasn't happening 20 years ago when I was in graduate school. We weren't talking about core principles. We weren't talking about America 20 years ago. And we're talking about America and the meaning of academia for American democracy today. And that, to me, is really exciting. That, to me, feels like a reawakening of the Enlightenment that is, for my mind, very hopeful. Postmodernism is dying. I find that very exciting. That's not to say I don't do cultural studies and gender studies. I do all of that, but I do it in an intellectually rigorous way that looks at evidence, right? And that takes seriously reality. Doesn't think clitorises are just socially constructed. They are, but they're also more than that. So that stuff really excites me. I think I still get really excited about students. I really, really do. Every time I go to a campus and they let me sit down for a few hours with especially undergraduates, although I also enjoy graduate students, I feel so much hope for the world. I feel like there is so much blossoming of, because these are the kids of the internet age, and you can't mess with them, right? Like, my son came home from high school the other day, and I said to him, what happened in your AP Lang class today? And he said, we had a discussion of the different rhetorical uses of the word fuck. And I said, did the teacher? And he said, oh no, Mr. Akers was very careful not to use the word. But the rest of us were talking about how it's sometimes an adjective and sometimes a verb, and we're talking about the political uses of it. And so some of you may know, my kid was a freshman in his sex ed class a few years ago, and he came home and told me that they were teaching abstinence, which made me hit the roof, because as I've often told them, I don't want you being abstinent before marriage. Because, I've always given him this lecture, right? First of all, you need to know what you're into before you end up in a long-term relationship. Secondly, that person has the right to be with a partner who has some experience. And, but anyway, so my main objection to abstinence education is it doesn't work. It's meant to prevent pregnancy and prevent disease, and it doesn't work. It instead makes sex shameful, and making sex shameful drives sex underground, and it means kids don't get what they need in terms of medical care, medical protection, but also good emotional relationships with the people they're having sex with, because it's driving sex underground. So he asked me if I wanted to come to class and see it, and I said sure. And he brought a paper to class. He looked up the evidence, and he brought the paper to class to show the teacher that abstinence education does not achieve its desired outcome. He's very much raised in an outcomes-based household. So he brings the paper to class, and I'm in the back of the room. At the time, I had only 200 Twitter followers, and I decided to start live tweeting the class. By the end of the class, I had 18,000 Twitter followers. 45 minutes later, I didn't realize what I was doing. And I don't think I would do it again, because if I was in the teacher's position, I would have been furious with me. I did actually get banned from the school, I think I learned today what the law was that banned me from the school. But the reason I want to tell you this story was not only because my son and his classmates stood up against this education as being fake, basically, that it claims to prevent pregnancy but doesn't really achieve what they claim. And the teaching in the class was just so bad. I'll tell you about it, or you can look up the tweets. It was so bad. So, for example, just a really quick example, the claim, this was 2 people we later found out were from this Christian organization. For some reason, our school was paying to come in and terrify and shame our children about sex. But one of the things the claim was that 1 out of times you use a condom, it'll break. And so it's true the condom will fail about 1 out of 6 times if you don't know what you're doing. But if you teach people how to use condoms, they fail much less often. And also you can use, of course, backup birth control. And of course, also not everybody is straight. But the lesson they wanted to teach was that 1 out of 6 times you use a condom, you're going to get pregnant. And so they had a game with the kids where they rolled a dice. Everybody was assigned a number 1 through 6. And by the time there were 8 rolls of the dice, everybody in the room was pregnant. So the lesson my son was being taught was that don't bother to use condoms because they don't work, right? And I was like, I really don't want you teaching my son don't use condoms, right? But anyway, so what ended up happening was they got really angry at me, and I was banned from the school with a registered letter. And I went back to the school anyway about a week later because there was a water polo game, and for complicated reasons, I run a newspaper for my city. And so I was going to live tweet the water polo game for the newspaper, but the Twitter system wasn't working. And I said to my son, the Twitter system isn't working in the school. And he said, that's because they shut it down because of you. And, and I said to him, well, darn it, does that mean I can't tweet the water polo game for the newspaper? And he said, oh, no. When they shut down the social media system in the school because of you, we looked at what the Chinese dissidents do. And he said to me, we discovered they use VPNs. So we set up a VPN, a virtual private network. He said, so those of us at the lunch table set up a VPN for the school, and everybody's on the VPN now. And he goes, let me just get you onto the VPN. He takes my phone and gets me on. That excites me, right? This is a generation of students that will not be censored and will not have knowledge denied to them. They will get the knowledge whether or not we want to give them the knowledge. And that, to me, is very exciting. But the combination of that and media illiteracy frightens the heck out of me. And the combination of that plus a world where they don't distinguish between news and commentary, and where most of the news, so-called news we're getting now is commentary, is very, very concerning for me. And it's part of why I'm working on local journalism now, is because I think local journalism is where we have to begin to do the work that helps this generation understand what it is they're encountering. They're smart enough, we just got to help them.
So I'm really unsure about asking this question now, because that was a really nice way to end. You went a little depressing at the end, so it's okay, I think. So I basically want to ask about size, right? So you think a lot of the problems in university life is because of branding, which is in part because they need to bring in money. And I think you're right. And you talk about these great experiences with students, but you've been at some great schools. Not all of us have those great experiences. And we've talked about administration and the need for more administration and more and more. Part of that is because of size, because government has gotten more involved, and so you need more regulations, and so you have more administrators to deal with those added regulations.
But it's also government's paying for less
yes,
in higher education.
Yes. But so here's the question. Is the root of the problem that we tried to make education for everyone, and so the system is so big that we need those extra regulations, which cause the need for extra administrators, and we have students in classes who aren't eager to learn, and you have faculty who aren't eager to teach those students, and you have a need to brand because the original brand was simple. It's light and knowledge. Mm-hmm. But now you have to distinguish it because you've got a lot more of it going on, so you need a lot more branding.
Yes, and maybe part of what needs to happen is a recognition, a cultural recognition that not everybody's ready for college. So one of the things I talk with undergraduates whenever I'm talking with undergraduates is I talk about the fact that I dropped out of college when I was 19. And I was second in my class of 711 from a very high prestige public New York high school. But I was burned out. I was totally burned out. And I went to Georgetown for a year and dropped out and became a mortgage broker for 5 years. And that was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do. And it's too often the case that students get the message that college is for everybody and it's shameful not to be in college. And I strongly encourage my students to consider dropping out if they have any doubt that now is the right time for them to be in college. And I point out to them that not only did I drop out of college, my sister also dropped out of college. She was also highly stressed out and exhausted, and now she's an MD and a nun, which is a weird combo. But she actually went back and got her MD after she became a nun, and she got it at Vanderbilt University when she was, I think, 34. So I try very hard to remind people that college is not for everybody. It's not for everybody in the moment, you know. And it's not just people who. It's not a question of intelligence. It's a question of, is it the right moment in your life? The idea, particularly for men, because young men are often not ready for college, of sending everybody into college is just a mistake. It's a real mistake. Gap years are a really good thing that's happening. A gap year probably would have saved me a lot of years if I had had a gap year. But in those days, there was no such thing. And my parents couldn't stand the thought of a gap year, So I'm a college dropout, and I tell students that all the time, that I'm a college dropout. And you can be one. It's fine. It's not a big deal. Thank you all very much for this conversation.